Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I am thrilled to bring you another exciting episode where we dive into the heart of ecological restoration and forest conservation. Whether you're a seasoned tree enthusiast, a budding ecologist, or just curious about the magnificent natural world, you're in for a treat. As always, a huge thank you to our loyal listeners for your ongoing support. You are the roots of this growing community. Today's episode features a special guest, Phil Stielstra, founder of an organization called Propagation Nation. We are diving into the world of coast redwoods, Latin name Sequoia sempervirens, and giant sequoias, Sequoiadendron giganteum, two of the planet's largest and most iconic tree species. Phil's lifelong love of trees began in childhood, climbing lilacs on his family's property and feeling connected to the natural world. This passion grew as he worked in Oregon's national forests, observing resilient seedlings sprouting in clear-cut areas, and later when he used oak to combat erosion on Lake Michigan's shores. After a long career at Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, Phil became a Seattle tree ambassador, leading community education initiatives and tree walks. Inspired by his connection with David Millark of the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive, Phil founded Propagation Nation, driven by his enduring admiration for trees. Phil has dedicated himself to championing the assisted migration of these ancient giants into the Pacific Northwest. Climate disruption threatens these trees in their current range and offers opportunity for them in newish locations where their ancestors used to grow. Now, this is a timely conversation because ecological restoration has entered a pivotal moment where strategies like assisted migration are not just innovative, they could be essential. Practitioners are increasingly adopting approaches that anticipate and respond to future climates. Sometimes we utilize resources like the International Standards for Ecological Restoration and even a new collaboratively created best management practice guide from the Forest Adaptation Network. I will include links to these key documents in the show notes. I feel like they can help us dial in our strategy for selecting seeds and other propagules that align with projected future climate conditions. This includes sourcing genotypes adapted to emerging climates, helps to ensure genetic diversity, and balances local adaptation with climate-resilient traits. Assisted migration, which is a progressive strategy, involves relocating species or populations to areas where they're expected to thrive under future climate scenarios. And that's what we're talking today, and this is just the latest in Tree Hugger episodes delving into this topic. One can track back to episodes featuring Dr. Sally Aitken, where we explored the science of climate-smart forestry. Also, Chelsea Armstrong, the historical ecologist, provided insights into Indigenous knowledge systems that have long guided land care and stewardship in the Forest Garden episode. Additionally, there was a Climate Feels episode which offered a reflective look at how climate adaptation intersects with emotional and cultural dimensions of restoration. This through line of adaptation underscores a shared vision: ecosystems that we help build, ecosystems that we support for tomorrow's challenges. By weaving together better practices, standards, ethics, and narratives from our field, we collectively move forward where both people and forests can flourish. Now, boomeranging back to this current episode, Phil shares his journey and we discuss the unique traits that make these trees good candidates for assisted migration. They have the ability to withstand fire, drought, and pests, as well as they have potential to thrive in the Pacific Northwest's evolving climate. As Phil notes, coast redwoods and giant sequoias are non-invasive species that could provide ecosystem services and biodiversity benefits. However, their introduction is not without challenges, such as their slow seed production and low natural regeneration. We'll also address the ethical and ecological considerations of introducing species to new environments and how Indigenous perspectives on land stewardship informs these decisions. Phil also lifts the hood and gives us some insight into the long-term goals of Propagation Nation. They have a Redwood Test Plot Grant Initiative which aims to study the viability of these species in new environments. This initiative highlights the intersection of science, community involvement, and intergenerational responsibility. From practical advice for forestry practitioners to heartwarming anecdotes about planting redwoods and sequoias in the Pacific Northwest, this episode will leave you hopefully more curious, inspired, and ready to dig into forest adaptation for yourself. Get ready to be captivated by the story of these ancient giants and how their legacy continues to shape our understanding of ecological restoration. Stay tuned and don't forget to follow us on social media at TreeHuggerPod to share your thoughts on today's episode. Let's dive in now and discover how these towering giants are helping to reimagine the future of our forests.
Yes, my name is Phil Stielstra, and I am currently the president of the nonprofit Propagation Nation. And I have to say, I'm smitten with redwoods. That's the best word I can come up with. There's something about them that is just entrancing. Certainly people who go to the old groves in California, you can hardly have words to explain what that experience is like. But even with the young trees, there's just something really special about them. They have such unique qualities. So I almost feel like the trees are guiding me. It's that kind of a thing. I don't have a background in forestry. I'm not a scientist. I've had many different jobs. But this has become my life's purpose now.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. I was going to ask that question about what are some of the characteristics and details you enjoy about coast redwoods and giant sequoias? Like, what really turns you on about these trees?
Well, first of all, they're tens of millions of years old. There are fossil remains from eastern Washington at the Berkeley Museum about redwoods having been here. They're the only conifer, probably the only tree that has 6 sets of chromosomes. They're called hexaploids. Humans just have 2 sets, one from each parent. But having 6 sets of chromosomes for each gene on their genome has allowed them to be highly adaptable over those 10 to 20 million years. So it's like they have really been deep learners. They do things that other trees don't do. They have heartwood that they embed with toxins to prevent decay, to prevent attack from insects. They have terpenes in their needles. Deer and elk are not inclined to browse them. They have bark, can be 10 to 12 inches thick, protect them from fire. If they burn in a really severe fire, they simply resprout. They can just continue to grow because their root systems are so strong and embedded with all of those resistance. Almost like they're immortal. They refuse to die. They can be harvested. If they're harvested for log, they just resprout, and they can resprout from the base or they can resprout from the trunk epicormically. So they're just super, super trees. You know, giant sequoias share some of those qualities of the redwood. More longevity, have the really thick cork like bark. They don't have the ability to reiterate the way redwoods do. They are really just simply one of the most beautiful trees. I mean, there's a reason they have such longevity. Just because they've done all of that work to take care of themselves.
Lovely. I think they are, really special trees. So where do redwoods and sequoias kind of quote unquote naturally occur today? And have they ever grown in the Pacific Northwest? I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of nativism, but I was wondering how you feel that shapes the debate around their assisted migration, particularly regarding their current historical range and current ecological suitability for the Pacific Northwest, and any ethical implications of relocating such like iconic species to a place where some people consider like they don't naturally occur right now.
That's a little bit of a hard question for me to respond to, Michael, because I take the long view. And these trees used to grow here. Climate change happened. The glaciers pushed them down to the coast of California and up to the Sierra Nevada mountains. The climate is such now, and has been for more than just the last 20 years, has been extremely suitable for them to grow. And people have, in the Northwest, people have been planting them here for 70 years or more. There are very large specimens in many cities around Washington. Shelton, Vashon Island, up at Seabeck. I mean, these are trees that got planted in the 1940s. Their diameters are like 7 feet in diameter. It is very well suited ecologically, climatically, perhaps even better now than perhaps parts of California. In California, they grow intermixed with all of our native species from the Northwest. So they are used to growing alongside of Doug fir and western hemlock and western red cedar, Sitka spruce. For them to be moved up north here and continue to do the same is just not a difficult thing. There are people that have been growing not just single trees, like there's one of the large redwoods in Olympia. It's called the Dan Evans tree because Dan Evans was such a supporter. And it's another 7-foot diameter tree. But there are people that have been planting forests of these since the last at least 30 years. So there are 4 redwood forests in various parts of Washington. And they're not invasive. They're not taking over any of the areas that are currently populated with hardwoods or other Northwest conifers that are considered native. Many of our native Northwest conifers are Johnny-come-latelys. They've maybe only been here for 10,000 years. The redwoods have been around for much longer. So in a sense, we consider we're just returning them home. So they are basically more native here than some of our natives. In a sense, humankind have always been transmigrating all kinds of things. And that's just what we do. It's what we've tended to do. When the dawn redwood, which was thought to be extinct, was discovered in a remote area of China in 1947, there are probably dawn redwoods in every corner of the world already now. And so it's what we do. If the tree were not at home in the Northwest, and we'll certainly learn more about that because I'll tell you a little bit later about some of the work we're doing to find out more about that. But I think it's a matter of how do you want to think about this and what's important. And when we look at the existential challenge of climate change, and that's not just an existential challenge to humankind. For Washington State, I don't know if you had a look at some of the climatological studies that the USDA and the Forest Service did about the viability of Northwest species up through 2090. And they're basically, the viability goes so low that Doug fir will only, by 2090, be surviving in the upper elevations of the Cascade Mountains. The Olympic Peninsula will basically not be viable for Doug fir. It won't be viable for western hemlock. It won't be viable for western red cedar. So what are we going to do as a state? Are we going to be able to stay the evergreen state? Or are we going to have to come up with a different name? I think I'm disturbed is that the state and the Forest Service and the DNR don't take this seriously enough that they're out there doing what we're trying to do. We're just a small nonprofit, a citizen-powered nonprofit to try to really address climate change, but also address the whole question of what is going to become of our forests in the Northwest.
Yeah, that's a lot there to unpack. I do agree with you. I think people have been moving plants around since time immemorial. We did formerly have a historical ecologist on the podcast, Chelsea Armstrong, who lives up in what is now British Columbia. One of my favorite professional papers from the last couple of years was one called Adopting a Root that she wrote with Nancy Turner and Dana Lepofsky. Maybe I'll put that in the show notes, but it is interesting how hundreds of species have been adopted by people and moved around via canoe culture and whatnot. So, yeah, and it's really fascinating. I do agree. Like, people have been doing this for years, and the fact perhaps that like the ancestors of redwoods have been here for years, and there's fossil records of that is kind of provocative as well. So when you do take that long-term perspective, I guess, what role do Indigenous perspectives and land stewardship play in your decisions about assisting migration of these species?
Well, that's really important to us. Before we started to scale up as a nonprofit, which we decided to do at the end of 2022, one of our group had been working with trees throughout the Olympic Peninsula his entire life. So he was familiar with many of the tribes, helped some of them plant trees and so on. Another member of our group who was actually running our nursery is actually a registered Blackfeet tribal person. And so really our perspective as a nonprofit is permeated with the idea that we're in this for the seventh generations. This is a long time thing. We can't just take this on as we're going to just do this for a little bit here. We're thinking about 7 generations into the future. We were at the nursery trade show in Portland. I was there with Bob Barnes, who has the nursery in Olympia that has held many of our plants. And so we were just talking to various vendors around the trade show. And one of the guys, after we kind of gave him our pitch, he turned and said, "Well, so what's in it for you? Why are you doing this?" And Bob just so quickly said, "I'm doing this for my grandchildren and for their grandchildren and for 7 generations. We're doing this for the future." So in that first 1,000 redwood project, and in another 1,000 the following fall, we actually gave away 800 of our redwoods and sequoias to 9 different tribes in Washington and Oregon, mostly Washington. And we've continued to provide trees to them. And if we had a bigger staff and just more people power, we'd be reaching out to more of the tribes because we see them as just so much in sync with what that indigenous population has always, how they've always seen trees, and especially the western red cedar tree.
Yeah, especially I do think of this. Yeah, oftentimes we know we need indigenous leadership, especially as settlers. Like I do identify as like a settler ecologist, and my family's been here in Washington anyway for a very long time, but it's not nowhere near compared to other people's ancestors. So yeah, I do feel like sometimes there's this urgency with climate change, that we're making decisions like and not bringing everyone along. So it's just like I think constantly like a check on myself or ourselves that we're making the proper decisions and engaging everyone, all our neighbors in a very, ethical way. It's interesting that people are adopting these trees into our ecosystem here where we live. I assume these species are really good at adapting to changing climates. So, like, what are the challenges in transplanting them to a new spot? And I guess what specific kind of traits do they have that make them good candidates for migrating them, especially in the face of some of the climate change challenges that you mentioned, like drought and just overall rising temperatures?
It's a really interesting situation. The coast redwood is a little bit more finicky about where it likes to grow. People think, and there's certainly truth to it, they think that for a coast redwood to grow, it needs fog. Because they grow so tall, it's a way for them to get additional water, and certainly get water when it's maybe not raining, because then that just drips down and feeds their root systems. We certainly have as much coastal area as California does. It's pretty equivalent simply because of Puget Sound's hundreds of miles of shoreline. There is a tree farmer whose tree farm is on the north side of Hood Canal, who planted an acre of redwoods back in 1990, and they are just growing about as fast as you can expect any tree to grow. They're growing about 4 feet a year. In 34 years, they've grown 135 feet tall. So do they need fog? They maybe get some fog there, but they do really well. But there's you don't even need to be on water for them to grow. If you know where to look when you're driving south from Olympia to Portland, there's a 4-acre grove of redwoods that you can see from the highway that were planted about 1992 by a woman who's now deceased, and that acreage was sold to Port Blakely, so that 4 acres of redwoods is now owned by Port Blakely. But there's no water anywhere near it. And it's a towering grove of redwoods that are they're probably pretty close in height to any of the tallest trees nearby, but it won't be long before they'll be easily recognizable from I-5.
Okay. Yeah, I do feel like they adapt well. Like, honestly, where they occur now is, from what I understand, a very small range, and it's maybe like 3 or 4 degrees latitude south of us, right? So They are accustomed, I guess, to a little bit warmer conditions. The coast redwood, right, perhaps living near the coast needs a little bit more moisture. We're definitely not lacking in that. The giant sequoia, honestly, I can almost from my window, giant sequoia, I don't know what it was. It was like a trend, I don't know, during like a World's Fair or something. I don't know. There's like a bunch of giant sequoias around Tacoma anyway. I feel like they're all planted around the same time, maybe by the same Boy Scout troop or whatever, But they are interesting. So I just had this question about, because at some point an individual tree, you plant it in the ground, and there's this expectation they're like mixing with the Douglas fir and the western hemlock and the western red cedar. So thinking about like time scale and like the future, at what point do we expect them to become like sexually mature and or produce like cones that throw seed out? And then you have this new generation of progeny that are really like establishing and dispersing in that new forest system. And because I have noticed, and maybe it is just because of the age of them, you said that, some of these trees have been planted like 70 years ago or whatnot. Sometimes I don't see, or maybe I just don't notice like cones on these trees. And I actually haven't seen a lot of seedlings like around where these trees have been planted. So my assumption is either they're young and they're not old enough to be like spreading, or there's maybe something wonky with maybe they don't produce cones. I've done some research in the past about some of this, and there's like some chatter online about perhaps like, moving them from a place that's more abundant with light to like our winters. Because right now we have like, I don't know, 16 hours of darkness that we're living through in the winter, that perhaps the photo period like creates some wonky conditions where they just don't, it kind of affects like how they mature.
Yeah. So I think with respect to their progeny, I've been interested and tried to pay attention. And what I've learned is redwoods, even in California, struggle creating new trees. Douglas fir, they got little wings on the seeds. Where I lived in Seattle, I had no lawn. There was a lot of salal and Oregon grape. And there would be a new crop of Doug fir coming up every single year. That just doesn't happen with redwoods. The seeds are like the size of a nail clipping. They just drop down at the bottom of the tree. If there even are cones, they are just not good at reproducing. The seeds are so tiny. You probably know the story of giant sequoia. It takes a fire to crack them open. And by then the ground is cleared and it's ready to take a new seed. So I think that's an interesting question, but certainly they are not invasive in the sense of overrunning places, because they're just spreading their seeds, new trees, and so on.
Yeah, there's that issue. Like people think there's this term in invasive biology about this thing called lag time, and it's like it's always seen as like this impending sort of threat, that you can introduce a species, perhaps usually like intracontinental introductions from like another continent, let's say, and introduce the species, and like maybe one or two or like a handful or a small amount, they won't be successful, but like over the landscape, you replicate that sort of introduction over the landscape, like let's say ivy or blackberry perhaps, and then over time, like decades, you see this like establishment and dispersal over the landscape and things start to dominate. So I don't know if we're in that lag time or even lag time. It's theoretical, right? But it is interesting. And that, like, honestly, I'm trying to have this reckoning with weeds and invasive species anyway, but that's where that nativism comes out, that sort of knee-jerk reaction that like we're sort of scared to adopt or any other species from outside our ecosystem, perhaps because it has this potential, like we're almost screening them for this potential to be invasive. And I do think it's nice to like you all have the local knowledge and some of the scientific wherewithal or understanding to kind of reason with that or sort of reckon with that.
And working with all of the Puget Sound parks, of course, it's a different entity being a park, because you're really in a position to want to kind of show off maybe some exotic something. But I never really ran into the native obstacle of, we can't do that. Those aren't native. But I did have a neighbor that had been volunteering as a steward with some of the Seattle parks, and she was really hardcore into native. And I didn't know that. I had a huge raspberry patch behind my house that had been planted by the people that I bought the house from. And every time the raspberries came in flush, I would bring a pint around to all of my neighbors. And I brought a pint up to her house, and I got read the riot act about no business planting redwoods. That's the only one.
Whoa,
I can take it.
Oh, they're out there. I can tell.
Oh.
I have a radar for nativists, I think. Yeah, I can tell within like 5 minutes.
Sure.
And especially when I tell people what I do. Like, they're like, yeah, they would just want to give me the go-to about weeds and things like that. I was like, I know. And so it is interesting with, I would say with park systems. Well, that gets me to the question about kind of policies, because sometimes there are governmental policy, like you mentioned, there are some policies at the state level or the local level that either encourage or leave the door open, or some kind of shut the door entirely because native plant policy is a trend, right? So I know some park systems are reckoning with that. And sometimes even the definition of native can be, often it can seem pretty straightforward, but then when you really need to define it in policy, it can be kind of loosey-goosey, right? So we think of these like watershed level native plant policies from the past, I guess, that are really, restrictive or very conservative, I would say. And then in some cases, some policies are more expansive and taking into account like the whole bioregion as native, right? So we often think we live within this Cascadia bioregion here in the Pacific Northwest, so that reaches down into very similar like plant associations that kind of show up over and over across our landscape, even all the way down into Northern California, even east out, across the mountains into, Idaho, Montana, within the Snake River, Columbia River drainages, and then even further north up into like Southeast Alaska, right? This is like generally considered the Cascadia bioregion. So that's many, many acres. It's like a big chunk of, it's a chunk of North America anyway. I guess we do a slow time check here. We got maybe like 10, 15 more minutes or so. Is there anything you want to touch on?
So at the end of 2022, when we decided we wanted to scale up to have a bigger impact because we were limited as far as the number of trees we could distribute by virtue of how many Archangel could send us. So we made the decision that we were going to start contracting with local nurseries to grow redwoods and sequoias. And we really set a very stretch goal to continue to increase every year until we got to 1 million redwoods and sequoias distributed yearly. Now, that might seem like a really insane number, but when you understand how many trees are planted each year in Washington and Oregon, do you have a guess, Michael, as to how many?
Oh, I'm so glad you're quizzing me. Let's say, I know one crew, there's a couple crews in particular that I'm familiar with that do kind of production forestry, replanting. I'm going to say 20 million.
In Washington, it's 52 million.
What?
In Oregon, it's 40 million.
Wow,
so 92
holy
million.
moly.
92 million. So if we were to get 1 million redwoods and sequoias out on an annual basis, that would just barely be 1% of what would be planted each year. And we really see the problem of sufficient size that we believe that percentage needs to be much higher. Because if those USDA, U.S. Forest Service climatological studies have any validity whatsoever, our state forestry is going to be in a world of hurt in only a few years. So what is the solution? We think redwoods are certainly one of the solutions. And sequoias potentially could be a part of that solution in a slightly different way. They're not quite seen as the timber trees that the redwood. But we could be planting sequoias up and down every highway. The state could be doing that. There is just so much open acreage that is safe to plant a giant tree where people wouldn't drive their car into it. But you could see it. Interestingly enough, when you drive south from Olympia to Portland, the closer you get to Portland, the more sequoias you see growing on, but you can see from the highway. But we could be doing so much more. All the interchanges and stuff. I mean, sequoias are such a beautiful tree, and they're not finicky like redwood. They can grow anywhere. They can grow in eastern Washington. They can grow in western Washington. They'll grow wherever a redwood. It's a highly robust tree, and they live forever. So why don't we take advantage of that? Last year, we distributed 14,000 sequoias and redwoods, mostly redwoods. This year, we purchased to have grown for us 42,000. So we're trying to triple each year. We purchased too many sequoias. We're not able to sell them all because they aren't seen as a timber tree, but we're almost sold out of redwoods. That's partly because we also started up a new program called a Test Plot Grant, where we offer 360 redwoods, which if you were planting it in a single species block would be about an acre, but we're not saying that's how you plant it. Honestly, we prefer you plant it in a mixed species arrangement. But 360 trees, Propagation Nation will grant to, and we're talking mostly to tree farmers who really know and are highly experienced at growing forests of trees, so that to be awarded a grant, you have to be willing to sign up to take some measurements and tell us how those trees do over the first 5 years. You have to tell us about how you planted them, how you prepped the soil, how you took care of competing vegetation, and so on. At the end of the first year, you have to tell us how many survived, and you have to pick out 50 of them and measure those for height, and so on. So that's the contract that we make. And we're interested in setting up as many test plots across western Washington and Oregon as we can. We've already signed up 22 tree farmers in western Washington. And it got announced much later than we had hoped by the Oregon Tree Farmer Association, right at the end of December. But we already have 11 applicants from that group. So we're already interviewing them starting next week. So if we sign up another 10, we'll probably end up with close to 30 test plots across Washington and Oregon. We'll certainly establish what works. We have people tell us what is the quality of the soil they're being planted in. We'll have them take pictures so we can see where they lie. Are they on a hill? And so on. We're looking for people to establish whether they are a viable timber crop or the Northwest. It would be ideal if the state or the federal government had a way of doing this, but we're going to do it just because we have the conviction that this is important enough to establish. So I mentioned at the end of my talk to the foresters and the DNR folks and the carbon traders who were at the meeting that were interested in doing this. We would love for even the DNR Olympic Region Experimental Group to take on a test plot. We do have one of the foresters in that area with 127,000 acres of forest land taking on a test plot. We are just trying to put a stake in the ground. Let's find out. We're hopefully the information that will tell people whether they want this to be happening or don't want this to be happening. What is the reality when we actually try it out?
Right. Sounds like y'all are making moves, stocking some really high-level foresters that control a lot of land in Washington State.
We're just beginning to do that because they're the ones who are planting 92 million trees. So assisted migration of these particular trees has not just been going on to the Pacific Northwest. There's been assisted migration to the United Kingdom of giant sequoias for a long time. All of the gardening Englanders are known for. They just latched onto giant sequoias big time. And there's an article that came out in The Guardian to the effect that there are over 500,000 giant sequoias growing in the United Kingdom compared to 80,000 in the native range in California. They call them, it's an interesting, they don't call them giant sequoias, they call them giant redwoods, but they're basically a sequoia. They're the Sequoiadendron giganteum.
Yeah.
The other migration is there's a whole redwood timber industry going on in New Zealand that Bill Liddy, who's a forestry professor from University of California at Berkeley, helped them start up. And that's been going on for years now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like they have a very similar sort of other side of the equator, other hemisphere, but definitely kind of a similar sort of climate, right? Okay. Nice, excellent. I do kind of want to get into this like entertaining portion of the podcast that I call rapid fire question round.
Sure.
Are you ready for it?
Yep.
I know this is hard. You might have revealed this answer a little bit earlier, but what's your favorite tree, redwood or sequoia?
Well, if I only get one, it's the redwood, just because they have such magical qualities. And they're virtually, it's like magical powers, and they're immortal.
Yeah, definitely being able to resprout from the base provides some immortalism a little bit.
But giant sequoia, I think that's just the most beautiful tree ever.
Yeah.
When I'm talking to a high school group from Tacoma here, and they come up to the greenhouse, and I had a bunch of sequoias. I said, the way you can tell a sequoia is it's like an upside down ice cream cone without the ice cream, because they're just so, unless they're planted in a big grove, then of course they don't have quite that dimension to them. But
true.
That's why they're so recognizable.
All right, moving on. Rapid fire question. If you had to explain ecological restoration in one word, what would it be? So if you could complete the sentence, restoration is.
I couldn't get it to one word, but I would say respect for the earth. And I will quote Chief Seattle: "Teach your children, we have taught our children that the earth is our mother." And he said a lot more than that. But to me, that's, if you respect the earth, then you'll treat it differently. It's not like you own it. It's part of the web of life. And humans are just part of the web of life. So we need to just treat it very differently. One of the persons that's a contract worker for Propagation Nation for the last 2 years, her phrase is love on the earth. That's what we should be doing. Love on the earth.
All right. Yeah, can't go wrong with love.
No.
I like that one. All right, next question. Most tiresome, frequently asked questions about these trees that you receive from the public or from the podcaster.
Don't those trees belong in California? Kind of a question.
That is, I think the belonging, if we really dig deep into that issue of belonging, it's just is a very like ethical question, and there's a lot of assumptions that go into it, and I could talk about it for a while. It's even not only with trees, but more, not just the more than human, but about how we feel about different kinds of people as well, like belonging in our communities.
It is, yeah. It's like the whole immigration issue writ large. You don't belong here. Oh, well, how recently did you come here?
True. Lovely. Glad to chat about that. Okay. You have a favorite song about trees, or maybe just generally kind of nature-related song that I can add to my playlist?
I'm sorry, it's not a tune that I can sing, but I can pass the words along to you. This song was written by Adgie Piper, who was a climate justice ambassador with Plant for the Planet Kids before they changed their name to Climate Families. But he wrote this song. We sang it at a couple of the plantings we did back in 2017. So I'll just read it to you because it's a lovely little verse. Ancient trees with redwood leaves clean the air that we all breathe. So it's a bad idea to cut them all down. Saving life from day to day. Planting is the only way to bring our carbon levels from the sky back to the ground. We want trees, green companies all around the world. So we took these redwood trees and plant them in the ground. And then there's a chorus of everybody. The ceremony can be like a tree in pursuit of your cause. And actually there's actions that go with stand firm, grip tight, bend with the winds of change, and learn tranquility. Lovely.
Boom.
Little verse.
Yeah. Making music. All right, cool. All right, last funny question. Would you rather have a backyard full of tiny bonsai sequoias or one giant redwood blocking the sun to your
I
house?
think you know that I'd go for the giant redwood blocking the sun.
All right. Well, it's been incredible, Phil. Thanks for going on this ride with me. Is there any last words, or can you tell people how to find you, how to find out more about Propagation Nation, how to reach out, how to get involved?
Yes. Certainly they can go to our website, and it's propagationnation.us. Somebody already had the .org, otherwise we would have. So sometimes we're a little bit difficult to find, but go there. There are there's a get involved page. Eager to have volunteers. There's a reason that nation is part of our name. We really want to grow this and have as many people involved many ways as possible. Really, when we revamped the website a couple of years ago, we wanted it to be really just clear and simple. Plant a tree simple. I mean, our message is basically, you can be anxious about climate change, or you can begin taking action and doing something your very self. Plant a tree. Now, when we set that up, we didn't have trees to sell. There are redwoods and sequoias that are sold that you can buy mail order. So we arranged for a discount for anybody that wanted to plant a tree to get a discounted tree that they could purchase from a company in California. But that's really the simple proposition that we offer to the world is, let's plant trees. Let's plant some more. And we just think these two species have some really superior values, especially with regard to carbon sequestration. And then they live for so long, they keep doing that for a really long time. So they are just very powerful from that point of view. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Great. Lovely. Man, I've learned a lot. We kind of circled around each other before, but I'm really glad we were able to sit down and have this chat and hash out some of these questions I've had. And it's really cool to learn about Propagation Nation and really the community startup that kind of grew out of the Tree Ambassador program, and basically you're really getting after it. So yeah, I really look up to you, and I really appreciate your the love ethic and sort of the future foresight and all that. So yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Michael, thank you for the invitation. You have a really good thing going with the Tree Hugger podcast.
A heartfelt thank you to our guest, Phil Stielstra, for sharing not only his work with coast redwoods and giant sequoias, but also for his stories and experiences that have shaped the vision for system migration. Your thoughtful perspective on restoration as a tool for addressing the challenges of a warming world reminds us of the profound connections between trees, ecosystems, and the communities that depend on them. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. This show thrives because of your curiosity and engagement, and we're grateful to share this journey with you. Tree Hugger Podcast is about more than trees. It's about reimagining ecological restoration as a way to support human health, livelihoods, and justice in the face of climate disruption. These are complex topics, and your willingness to explore them with us makes all the difference. If this episode resonated with you or even challenged you, we encourage you to reflect on it, share it with others, and continue the conversation. You can also support the podcast by rating and reviewing it on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback not only helps us reach new audiences, but also deepens the dialogue around the vital role of ecological restoration in a changing world. Until next time, let's keep asking big questions and seeking thoughtful answers. Follow us on Tree Hugger Pod to share your thoughts. Take care, and we'll see you in the woods.